Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks to CEDA for the opportunity to speak with you today. I really appreciate it, and yeah, thanks to the Minister for coming along as well. It's great to see him here. What I thought I'd do in the 15 minutes I have is focus maybe on the bigger picture. So some of the big trends around the world that are going on that are water related, and how those might play out over the next 20 years, and draw some parallels between what's happening globally and what's happening here, because there are many, and there's a lot of parallels. And through that, to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the solutions and some of the reasons for real optimism, I believe. So I'll talk a little bit about some megatrends work that CSIRO does as your national science agency, and focus on a couple of those megatrends, particularly around the water, food, energy nexus. And as I said, some reflections on what some of those challenges mean for policy, innovation, and directions. Prediction is difficult, especially about the future, is apparently a Danish proverb, and also something that Niels Bohr said in his Nobel Prize-winning speech. So whenever we're looking at the big trends and things that are going to happen over the next 20 years, you know, there's always a lot of uncertainty there. But nonetheless, I think it's instructive. And if you're interested in this megatrends work that CSIRO has done and presented at Davos and so on, it's all on the website, and it makes some pretty interesting reading. In the latest incarnation, we've identified these 7 big planetary trends. And I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. I'll focus probably on a couple very quickly. More from less means we got to get more out of every unit of resource on the planet because of the pressures around population and so on. Planetary pushback is around how the world's ecosystems are starting to push back against our efforts to extract more and more on the planet. The Silk Highway, obviously, is around the emergence of the big Asian economies and how that's transforming how the world works in an increasingly globalized world. Forever Young is about population trends in the West. That means aging populations who want to try and stay younger. And in the demographics of the developing world, we've got a huge triangle of very young human beings rising up. Digital immersion, we all know about the transformational power that's already rippling through the way we live and through our economies of the digital technologies. Porous boundaries is really about globalization and how clear-cut boundaries between jurisdictions are starting to melt away, and the great challenges that presents us. And great expectations, lastly, about how the whole world, but particularly the developing world, is now expecting to live the way we do. And the implications of that, obviously, not only for water, but for resources of all kinds. I'm going to really focus on largely these 4, but mostly the top 2 in the next few minutes. So the biggest trend that drives everything else is this one: population growth. So both the US Census Bureau and the UN predict that by 2050 we're going to be topping 10 billion people on the planet. We're now at 7 billion. And there are a number of new studies that suggest that we might overshoot that 10 billion mark, with China now moving away from one-child policy and so on. But nonetheless, just to give you a visceral feel for what that means, it means that for certainly the rest of my life, the next 35 years, don't expect to be around too much longer than that, there's going to be another city the size of Perth on the planet every week. Shavunk. Thunk. Thunk. So you can just imagine every week another city the size of ours with that many people and all the infrastructure and all the demands that go with it every week for the next 35 years. That's a huge and daunting task. And we, as I said, with great expectations, these people are all demanding to live better than we do, or as well as we do, sorry. So this is driving a lot of things, including this kind of thing, which is a direct outtake from our megatrends work. So if you look at the global income distribution in 2010, and you compare it to what we and others are predicting by 2050, you'll see some really interesting things there. The rich people like us, we continue to be at the top, but we're a very narrow, slender spike of population. But those big, colorful chunks, the red one, China, the mustardy colored one, if that's it, and the yellow one, or India and the rest of the world, Africa and so on, moving up that scale and really coming into that high income threshold, which means buying power, but also means a lot more footprint and huge demands. And water is one of the central ones, as I'll come to in a second. And so with all of this, global food demand is rising, not just because there's more people, but there's more people wanting to eat well and get the same calorific and nutritional value that we do. And so some interesting stats there just chucked up for you to have a look at, but more food will need to be produced apparently in the next 50 years than has been produced in the last 10,000 combined. So there's a daunting challenge because the planet isn't getting any bigger. You know, the conservation of mass and conservation of energy rules still apply. And so the demand for grain, for instance, is projected to double by 2050. And by the way, is largely globally plateaued in the last decade. And those 4 little bullet points on the side there are some of the things that are pushing back against our ability to produce that much food. So currently, I don't know if we produce enough food in Australia for between 50 and 60 million people. So we're a big net exporter. But when we talk about, for instance, feeding the world, you think about we're 20 million here, so we might be feeding another 30 or 40 million. That's pretty well a drop in the bucket when you start talking about 3 billion extra people coming on the planet in the next little while. So that's why our role in this is important, but we have to be realistic. So a lot of people talk about this trilemma, or whatever you want to call it really, but it's the energy, food, water nexus. And the fact that how we grow food and produce food needs a lot of energy, and how we access water and drive water into production of food also takes energy, and that all of these things are intimately connected. And at the middle, if you will, is our climate and the natural ecosystems around which all of this has to happen. And so any conversation, I think one of the key points I'd like to try to leave you with is that any conversation about water is incomplete if it doesn't consider the boundaries and the intimate relationships with these other major global issues. Energy production, so how do we get our energy? Is it going to contribute to climate change, which I'll come to in a second, or not? And also, obviously, the food element, the agricultural element, which is the dominant water user around the world by far. So just to give you an idea of how, and I think everybody knows this, but I'll throw it up anyway because it's kind of cool for my new country, my new adopted country. But Australia is the driest inhabited continent on the world, but it also has the highest per capita water use. And that polarity, that sort of bipolar sort of feel, has driven the world's most advanced water management and water policy and use of market stance in the world. And we're the envy of the world. And CSIRO is lucky because we do a lot of work with other countries where people are demanding our expertise and our experience in this area. The challenges, though, are real for us, and that's that climate is starting to have an effect. The minister spoke about that in her address. Rainfall distribution has already changed significantly over the last 65 years. This is data from the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO, trend in annual rainfall. So we're seeing the north get wetter, the northwest in particular, and a lot of the traditional food producing parts of our country getting a lot drier. And in fact, this is even more stark. This is new data from the State of the Climate report that we do with our partners in the Bureau, but it's really in that southern wet season. And the dark red bits are not just lows on the average. Those are the lowest ever on record rainfall. So you can see here that we're pushing into new territory, and that the climate is shifting. It's shifting now. This isn't a future problem. It's having impact today on how we can produce food and on our water availability, exactly as the minister had stated. And of course, those are in areas, these are the Murray-Darling Basin and the Wheat Belt. These are two of our biggest food producing areas, as we all know. So these are real challenges, and we're facing them right now. And because of this, Australia's been and continues to be very, very interested in water reform. And one of the things that we're the best at in the world is in creating markets. Unleashing the power of markets to be able to allocate water to its best and most valuable use. And with that, entailed in that is the pricing and the valuation of water, which I'm very keen on and is a whole subject in and of itself. But I'll give you a little example of how this can be how it can be incredibly powerful. So don't worry too much about the data, but these couple of graphs are really showing some of the things that happened during the Millennium Drought. And what you see is those big, those light blue bars going downwards, that's the decline in available water during the Great Millennium Drought. And you can see that at the height of it, we were down 70%. So we only had a third, or less than a third of the water that growers and users were used to was in the system. And the blue bars is the agricultural productivity in dollars. And what you actually see is by the end of the Millennium Drought, and I'll try to get the laser point working here, you've still got around a 60% drop in the amount of water that's available, but you're actually now swinging out of this. Innovation is taking place. Water allocation markets are sending water to the best and most valuable users, and we're actually producing more value than we were before. And this is an incredible illustration of just how powerful these markets can be and of the price and the importance of pricing water, but also of pricing it at its best use. One of the things that didn't happen through this process, unfortunately, was that there was a neglect of the environmental water use. And so there was a market failure in there that the federal government has had to come in and address. So that's another issue, is about pricing reflective of real value, not just market value if those markets have failures. I'd like to leave you with one last bit of new work that's very exciting that CSIRO has just completed. We call it Australian National Outlook. It's the first study of its kind ever completed in the world. It basically is an integrated evidence-based assessment of possible futures for Australia, looking at our economy and the direct connection with economic models with physical models of the physical flow of water, energy, food, and carbon and other things in our environment. And what are the possible directions that we could take over the next 35 years as a nation? And I don't have time to tell you much about it, but I will cover a couple of what I think are the most important findings. It's on the web. You can have a look at it if you want. So as I said, it's really about connecting these kinds of things into an integrated analysis. So it isn't just about GDP and about markets, but we're bringing in consumptive use, leisure, land use, water, food, and so on into the picture. So the first thing that we found is that the water, food, energy nexus, how these things interplay, is incredibly influential in how the future of Australia might play out under different scenarios, particularly in rural areas. And again, these are very busy slides, and they're not meant for me to point out anything in particular to you, other than to say that under a number of scenarios that we could decide to take, another directions that we could decide collectively to take in Australia, rural Australia becomes far wealthier than ever before. But the way we use water and land and energy in rural Australia changes significantly. One of the things we found is that rising water demand can be met under all scenarios that we looked at, from very business as usual scenario to one where we're really stretching ourselves to become world leaders in, for instance, water efficiency, carbon management, and so on. So these are different trajectories based on different scenarios. This is a stretch target, becoming really efficient. You can see water use can plateau and climb. And this is our business as usual trajectory, where we're using a lot more water and have to, in the orange case, really invest heavily in desalination and water recycling. This is just one aspect of it. Another really interesting part of this is that when we look at the choices that we make and the different trajectories we could take, we looked at the impact of individual choices on that, and we looked at the power of collective choices. And it's very, very clear from the data that it's what we decide to do together, collectively, as organizations, as companies, as governments at all levels, that will shape the future. Individuals, I don't have a car, I ride my bike every day, right? And that's cool, it makes me feel good. And it does have a tiny contribution, but that kind of thing alone won't change the direction or determine the direction we take. It's collective policy choices that matter, excuse me. Yep, great, 1 minute, thank you. One of the things that we do find in the Australian National Outlook is for the first time ever, Australia has the opportunity to decouple the growth and environmental prosperity and wealth of Australians from environmental degradation. So since European settlement, those two things have gone in lockstep, but in opposite directions. We've gotten richer, but our our environment has suffered. The business as usual trajectory maintains that widening gulf, but there are a number of choices that we could make as a nation that would see for the first time increased wealth and a reversal of environmental decline to the point where, for instance, species loss would reverse for the first time in our history. And it depends entirely on the choices that we take, which is, I think, a really optimistic and very, very heartening finding. So this is my summary very, very quickly. The water, food, energy nexus is really important, and to the degree that we talk about water alone and without that broader context, we're missing a lot of the story. A drive for water efficiency in Australia has yielded huge benefits, and obviously unlocking the power of markets and pricing, especially full value pricing, can be an incredibly powerful tool to get the kinds of outcomes we want. And to recognize that water is one of these things that has competing uses, including the needs of the environment. Without water going to the environment as well, we have real problems there. I mentioned the collective policy choices. That's becoming very, very clear. And our need, particularly in Southwest WA, to adapt to a changing climate has never been more real and more important. Thank you very much.